Imagine a country so afraid of dishonest money that it was willing to execute anyone who tampered with it. Not a counterfeiter in some dark alley, but any official who dared to weaken the coinage itself. That sounds like something from a medieval kingdom, yet it was written into law by the young United States in 1792. At a time when the nation was still fragile, with memories of revolution fresh and the ink on the Constitution barely dry, Congress quietly passed a law that would shape not only American finance, but the global monetary order for the next 2 centuries. It was called the Coinage Act of 1792, and on paper, it looked technical, even boring, a legal blueprint to create a mint, define coins, and standardize the dollar. But hidden in its clauses was something far more radical, a moral vision of money itself. To feel the weight of that decision, you have to go back to Philadelphia in the early 1790s. The United States was an idea more than an empire, a thin strip of states along the Atlantic trying to survive in a world dominated by old European powers. George Washington was president, a living symbol of the Revolution, and at his side stood Alexander Hamilton, the intense and controversial Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton understood something most people miss even today. You cannot have true independence if you do not control your own money. The Revolution had thrown off British rule, but not British pounds. In markets and taverns across the new nation, people still traded with Spanish silver pesos, British pounds, Dutch guilders, and a messy assortment of private banknotes. Each region had its own habits, its own conversion rates, its own suspicions. The scars of monetary failure were fresh. During the War of Independence, Congress had printed paper notes called Continental dollars to finance the struggle. Those notes collapsed so badly in value that a bitter phrase entered the language, "not worth a continental." It wasn't just a joke, it was a warning. People had seen their savings evaporate into worthless paper. Trust in money, especially in government-issued paper, was shattered. So when Hamilton set out to build a financial system, he knew he could not simply ask Americans to believe in ink on parchment again. He had to root the new dollar in something that felt solid, tangible, and incorruptible. The solution he proposed was metal. The Coinage Act of 1792 created the United States Mint and declared that the dollar would be the basic unit of account for the new nation. But this dollar was not a vague symbol. It was defined with almost obsessive precision. 371.25 grains of pure silver, roughly 24 grams. In other words, a dollar wasn't just a word, it was a specific weight of real metal you could hold in your hand. The law then laid out a full hierarchy of coins, from copper cents to silver dollars to gold eagles, all tied to that original definition. To keep the system balanced, Congress fixed the legal relationship between gold and silver at 15-1. $15 worth of silver was equivalent to $1 worth of gold. In theory, this bimetallic system would give the country both stability and flexibility. Gold as the anchor of high-value trade, silver as the everyday money of farmers, shopkeepers, and workers. Hamilton's design was not just technical, it was symbolic. The act prescribed how the coins should look. One side would bear the word liberty and a figure representing it, a reminder that this money was born from a revolution against monarchy. The other side would carry the eagle, the emblem of the republic. Every coin was meant to be a tiny piece of national propaganda, telling citizens that their money came not from a king's face or a private banker's signature, but from a law passed by their representatives and backed by real metal. In an age when European rulers still debased their coinage in secret, America was declaring that its money would be honest, visible, and measurable. And then came the most striking clause of all. The act made it a capital crime for officers of the mint to debase or fraudulently alter the coins they produced. Death for tampering with money. To modern ears, that sounds extreme, out of proportion. But to the founders, it made perfect sense. Debasing the currency was not treated as a clerical error or a policy adjustment. It was viewed as theft from the entire population at once. If you silently reduce the silver in a dollar, you steal from every worker who saved those dollars, every merchant who accepts them, every contract written in them. The young republic, still haunted by the collapse of the Continental, wanted to put a wall of fire around the meaning of a dollar. For a time, that wall held. American coinage became known for its reliability. A dollar was a dollar because it meant a specific weight of metal, not a politician's promise. Foreign merchants recognized and accepted U.S. coins. Ordinary people learned to trust the clink of silver in their hands in a way they would never trust paper again. The new system did not wipe away speculation, fraud, or inequality, but it gave the country something priceless, a monetary yardstick that did not change every time Congress had a bad year. But even in this elegant design, a tension was already building. Fixing the gold-silver ratio at 15-to-1 may have looked reasonable in 1792 based on market prices at the time, but the world does not freeze for laws. As global trade expanded and new mines were discovered, the actual market ratio between gold and silver shifted. By the early 19th century, gold was increasingly undervalued in American law compared to its price abroad. That meant that anyone with gold had an incentive to ship it out of the country or melt it down rather than keep it in circulation as U.S. coins. Meanwhile, silver, being relatively overvalued in domestic terms, began to disappear overseas where it could fetch a better price. Gresham's law, the old principle that bad money drives out good, began to operate in slow motion. What had been designed as a balanced dual metal system started to tilt. The coins that represented the good metal at the legal ratio vanished into hoards and foreign markets, while inferior forms of payment remained. The more the legal ratio diverged from reality, the more people behaved rationally in ways that undermined the very stability the law was meant to create. This is one of the quiet ironies of the Coinage Act. Its moral clarity about what a dollar should be ran headfirst into the messy, shifting nature of global commodity markets. Yet even as these cracks formed, the symbolic power of the 1792 decision remained enormous. The United States had, in effect, written into law a radical idea that money should serve the citizen, not enslave them, that its value should be rooted in something outside the whims of rulers, that inflation and debasement were not clever tools of policy but forms of corruption. For decades, the system created by the act gave the American dollar a reputation for honesty that would later make it the backbone of world finance. When people talk today about sound money, whether in the context of gold, Bitcoin, or anything else, they are echoing instincts that were already codified in that early statute. Looking back from the 21st century, where money can be created with a keystroke and inflated away with a policy statement, the harsh death penalty in the Coinage Act looks almost prophetic. The founders believed that tampering with the substance of money was a crime against trust itself. Today, similar outcomes are achieved not by shaving silver off coins, but by quietly expanding the money supply, manipulating interest rates, and normalizing permanent inflation. What would have been treated as debasement in 1792 is now framed as stimulus, quantitative easing, or necessary flexibility. The tools evolved, but the moral question did not. When the unit of value drifts, who gains and who loses? The story of American money, then, begins with a promise carved into law, backed by metal and fear of abuse. But it does not stay there. As the young republic expanded westward, fought wars, and industrialized, the clean lines of the Coinage Act collided with the messy realities of politics, debt, and ambition. The system that was meant to protect ordinary citizens from manipulation would gradually be reshaped to serve those who could bend the rules of money itself. That evolution did not happen overnight. It unfolded through a series of seemingly small adjustments, technical reforms, and emergency measures that, step by step, moved the United States away from the founding ideal of honest coin. And it is in the 19th century, amid territorial expansion, banking panics, and the rise of railroads and industry, that the first major breaks from the original blueprint appear. The gold-silver ratio would be rewritten, paper promises would begin to creep back into circulation, and eventually, Congress would pass a law so controversial that angry farmers and workers would call it a crime against the people. To understand how we reached a world of fiat currency and invisible inflation, we have to trace how that original metallic promise was chipped away, one decision at a time. The first obvious fracture in that original design came in 1834, and it arrived dressed up as a technical adjustment. By then, the United States was no longer a fragile coastal republic. It was expanding westward, building canals and roads, and dreaming of a continental destiny. But beneath that optimism, the mismatch between the legal gold-silver ratio and the real market ratio had become too large to ignore. So Congress changed the official ratio from 15-1 to roughly 16-1. On paper, it sounded like a minor recalibration, a simple attempt to bring the law in line with global prices. In reality, it quietly rewired the system. Overnight, gold became more attractive relative to silver under U.S. law, and silver coins, already under pressure, were pushed further out of circulation. They were melted down, exported, or hoarded, while gold coins increasingly dominated high-value transactions. The United States, which had proclaimed itself a bimetallic nation in 1792, slipped, without fanfare, into a de facto gold standard decades before it was formally acknowledged. This shift was not neutral. Gold and silver did not just differ in color. They represented different relationships between money and society. Silver was more abundant, more accessible, and more closely tied to the daily lives of farmers, small merchants, and workers. Gold was denser, rarer, and more closely associated with large transactions, international trade, and the financial elite. By tilting the system in favor of gold, the law also tilted it toward those who already sat closer to the centers of capital and commerce. In the 1850s, the discovery of gold in California poured new metal into the system. The U.S. Mint worked overtime, stamping fresh gold coins that flowed through the economy. One might expect that such a surge of gold would ease tensions, but the fixed legal ratio still kept silver sidelined. The country now lived with a strange hybrid monetary reality, officially bimetallic, functionally leaning gold, permanently trying to reconcile an old ideal with new economic facts. Then came the ultimate stress test: Civil War. When the Union and the Confederacy tore the country apart in 1861, the cost of survival exploded. Cannons, rifles, uniforms, railroads, food for armies, all of it demanded spending far beyond what the federal government could cover with taxes or existing reserves of gold and silver. Faced with this brutal arithmetic, Washington did something the founders had tried to guard against. It turned back to pure paper. The government began issuing greenbacks, unbacked paper notes declared to be legal tender. For the first time since 1792, American money floated free of metal. The immediate effect was brutally simple. Prices soared. In many cities, the cost of essentials doubled. Soldiers who were paid in greenbacks watched their wages lose value between the battlefield and the marketplace. Savers, who had trusted the sanctity of the dollar, found that sanctity dissolving. Yet speculators and those with access to gold, government contracts, or financial markets found ways to profit from the chaos. They could arbitrage between paper and coin, between present promises and future payouts. The Civil War turned money itself into a battlefield, and in that war, the spirit of the Coinage Act suffered a serious wound. The founding principle that money should be honest, anchored to metal, and protected from manipulation was suspended in the name of national survival. After the war ended, the country faced a haunting question. Should it go back? Should the United States restore the old metallic discipline and force greenbacks to be redeemed in gold and silver, even at the cost of painful deflation? Or should it embrace the new flexibility of paper credit, accepting inflation and discretion as tools of modern finance? This was not a dry academic debate. It divided the country along deep social and regional lines. Farmers, indebted and squeezed by falling crop prices, wanted soft money, more paper, easier credit, a bit of inflation to lighten their debt burdens. Bankers, creditors, and industrialists argued for hard money, a strict return to gold to preserve the value of their assets and the integrity of contracts. That clash culminated in one of the most consequential and least understood monetary decisions in U.S. history, the Coinage Act of 1873. With little public attention, Congress removed the standard silver dollar from the list of legal tender coins. Silver was effectively demonetized. The dollar was now, in law as well as practice, a gold-based currency. At the time, the law was framed as a tidy modernization, aligning U.S. money with what elites considered the more civilized gold standard of Europe. But its impact was brutal for many. Agricultural prices fell, deaths became heavier in real terms, and deflation tightened its grip. A dollar defined by scarce gold meant that the supply of money grew slowly, if at all, while the needs of a growing, indebted population expanded rapidly. Farmers and small business owners felt as if the ground beneath them had turned to stone. They renamed the law with a bitter nickname, the Crime of '73. The anger that followed was not just about coins. It was about power. Movements like the Greenback Party and the Silverites rose up to challenge what they saw as a rigged system. Their rallying cry, "Free Silver," was a demand to remonetize silver, to reopen the monetary system to a more abundant metal, and to ease the deflationary chokehold of gold. This populist revolt reached its emotional peak in 1896, when William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic presidential candidate, delivered his famous Cross of Gold speech. In it, he thundered, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." It was more than a metaphor. Bryan was accusing the gold standard of sacrificing ordinary Americans, farmers, workers, debtors, on the altar of creditor convenience and financial orthodoxy. His words echoed the old moral language of 1792, but now turned against a system that had drifted far from its original promise of protecting the common citizen. Bryan lost the election, and the gold standard won the war. By 1900, the United States had officially codified gold as the sole basis for its currency. The bimetallic dream that had animated the original Coinage Act was dead. No longer did both metals share the burden of supporting the economy. Now, a single scarce metal defined the money supply. The citizens' direct link to money as a tangible thing they could measure and weigh in their hands weakened further. Instead, control over the money system concentrated in the hands of those who could manage gold reserves, write banking law, and shape credit. The irony is sharp. A law once crafted to ensure that money served the people had gradually evolved into a framework that served those who controlled the levers of finance. The rules of money had become a quiet weapon, determining who would thrive and who would be squeezed, not through open robbery, but through the invisible mechanics of deflation, credit, and scarcity. As the 20th century dawned, the next transformation took shape. The U.S. economy was now industrial, urban, and deeply entangled with global finance. Bank runs and panics repeatedly exposed how fragile the system really was when too many people demanded gold or cash at once. In response, political and financial elites proposed a central solution, a new institution that could sit above the banks and above the old metallic discipline, an institution that could create liquidity in a crisis and smooth out the cycles of fear and greed. In 1913, that institution was born, the Federal Reserve. On paper, it was a guardian of stability. In practice, it represented a fundamental shift in who held the ultimate power over money. No longer was value simply defined by a fixed weight of metal, it was increasingly defined by the decisions of a small group of unelected officials who could expand or contract credit with the stroke of a pen. The ideals of the Coinage Act, that money should be measurable, moral, and resistant to manipulation, were now sharing space with a new philosophy, one that saw money as a flexible instrument of policy. The stage was set for the next great test. Within 2 decades, the United States and the world would plunge into the worst economic crisis in modern history, and the new central banking regime would face a trial by fire. The Great Depression would not only shatter lives and businesses, it would force a brutal question onto the table. When money is anchored to gold but controlled by policymakers, who does it ultimately serve in times of panic? The people who use it or the system that issues it? When the roaring 1920s finally snapped, it wasn't just stock prices that crashed, it was faith itself. In October 1929, the illusion of endless prosperity evaporated in a matter of days. Markets plunged, fortunes disappeared, and a wave of fear rolled through banks and businesses across the country. Under a classical gold standard, money was supposed to be solid, a fixed unit of weight that kept speculation in check. But now that money sat at the center of a spiraling catastrophe. As deflation took hold, prices fell, but debts did not. Every dollar owed became heavier, harder to earn, more painful to repay. Banks failed by the thousands. People lined up to withdraw their savings only to find the vaults empty or the doors locked. And as trust in banks collapsed, trust in paper suffered with it. In a world where gold was still seen as the ultimate anchor, people did what humans have always done in times of fear. They hoarded the one form of money they believed couldn't lie. Gold coins and certificates vanished into hiding, buried, locked away, tucked under mattresses. This made perfect sense on an individual level, but collectively it created a deadly paradox. The more people tried to protect themselves by clinging to gold, the less gold remained in circulation to support the banking system and the broader economy. Credit shrank, businesses starved for liquidity, and unemployment soared. The gold standard, once praised as a symbol of trust and stability, had become a kind of monetary straitjacket. It prevented the government and the Federal Reserve from expanding the money supply enough to break the deflationary spiral without risking a run on their own gold reserves. The system that was supposed to guarantee monetary honesty had become too rigid to handle mass panic. In 1933, in the depths of this crisis, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a decision that would have shocked the men who wrote the Coinage Act of 1792. Through executive order, he required Americans to turn in their gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates to the government in exchange for paper dollars. Private ownership of most forms of monetary gold became illegal. The metal that the founders had used as a shield against abuse was suddenly reclassified as contraband. Citizens who had saved in gold as a form of safety now found that safety subordinated to the needs of the state. The act of hoarding gold, which in an earlier era would have been seen as prudence, was now treated as a threat to national recovery. The transformation didn't stop there. After confiscating the public's gold at the official price of $20.67 per ounce, the government then raised the official price to $35 per ounce. On the surface, this was a way to devalue the dollar and make U.S. exports more competitive, injecting inflation into a deflation-ravaged economy. But look at what really happened beneath the policy language. Every ounce of gold that had been surrendered by citizens at the old price instantly became more valuable on the government's balance sheet. The state's gold reserves surged in nominal value, while the purchasing power of the dollars held by the public dropped. Without firing a shot, the rules of money had been rewritten in a way that shifted wealth from individuals to the central authority. The Coinage Act had once threatened death for those who debased the currency. Now, under crisis conditions, debasement had been legalized and repackaged as rescue. Morally, this marked a turning point. The founders had treated sound money as a shield to protect the people from government abuse. Roosevelt's actions, whether you see them as necessary or not, established a new precedent. In a moment of perceived emergency, the state could change the definition of money, rewrite contracts, and reorder who gained and who lost. The old logic, that money should be beyond manipulation, was replaced by a new doctrine, that money is a tool the government can and must shape to manage the economy. From that point onward, the spirit of the 1792 Coinage Act was no longer in charge. It had become a historical reference point, overshadowed by a more flexible, more dangerous philosophy. After World War II, the United States emerged not just as a military victor, but as the central pillar of a new global financial order. Europe and much of the world lay in ruins. American factories were intact, its gold reserves massive, its political influence unmatched. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a post-war monetary system. The result was a compromise between the old gold discipline and the new reality of powerful states and central banks. Under the Bretton Woods system, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. Foreign governments and central banks could still redeem dollars for gold, but ordinary citizens could not. On paper, the dollar was as good as gold. In practice, gold was now a privilege of nations, not individuals. This arrangement worked as long as the world believed that the United States would not create more dollar claims than it could redeem in gold. But as the decades passed, that promise grew harder to keep. The U.S. government spent heavily on rebuilding Europe, on expanding social programs at home, and on waging expensive wars abroad. Each of those choices required money, and printing dollars was always easier than raising taxes. Foreign central banks accumulated those dollars as reserves, trusting that they could be converted into gold whenever needed. But the math was simple and relentless. The volume of promises was growing faster than the stock of metal behind them. By the 1960s, the imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. Some foreign leaders began to suspect that the United States was quietly exporting inflation to the rest of the world by issuing more dollars than its gold could honestly support. One of the boldest responses came from France. President Charles de Gaulle openly criticized the exorbitant privilege of the dollar and began redeeming French dollar reserves for American gold. The French even sent a warship to New York Harbor to collect physical bullion, a vivid, almost theatrical gesture of distrust. Each shipment of gold leaving U.S. vaults was a reminder that the Bretton Woods promise was cracking. The system was reliving, on a global scale, the same contradiction that had haunted earlier metallic regimes: too many claims on too little metal. By the early 1970s, the United States stood at a crossroads eerily similar to those earlier monetary turning points. It could tighten its belt, raise interest rates, and restore discipline to preserve the gold mink at the cost of domestic pain. Or it could abandon the constraint altogether. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon chose the latter. In a televised address, he announced that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold for foreign governments. That temporary measure quietly became permanent. The gold window closed. and with it, nearly 180 years of formal connection between the US dollar and the metallic foundation of the Coinage Act came to an end. From that moment on, the dollar was a pure fiat currency, a piece of paper or a digital entry whose value rested entirely on trust in the issuing authority. No fixed weight of silver or gold defined it. No automatic discipline limited how many units could be created. Money had been fully transformed from a measurable substance into a policy variable. For a while, the consequences were dramatic and obvious. The 1970s saw surging inflation, oil shocks, and a painful reckoning with what it meant to let money float free. Eventually, central banks fought back with high interest rates and new doctrines, promising that, although the dollar was no longer backed by metal, it would be backed by credibility and technocratic management. And slowly, the extraordinary became normal. Inflation was no longer a scandal, it was a tool. A slow erosion of purchasing power, 2% a year, maybe a bit more, was recast as healthy, even desirable. The death penalty for debasement had long since disappeared. In its place, we accepted a quiet, continuous debasement as the background music of modern life. Few people measured their losses in grams of silver anymore. They measured them in shrinking savings accounts, rising prices, and the feeling that no matter how hard they worked, the future always seemed to move just out of reach. Today, most of that drama is invisible. Money no longer jingles in pockets as silver or stacks in vaults as paper. It flickers on screens, slides through apps, lives as digits in databases. Only a tiny fraction of the world's money exists as physical cash. The rest is credit and code, numbers that can be summoned or erased with a few keystrokes at a central bank or commercial bank. This digitization has made everyday life smoother. You can pay across continents in seconds, move funds with a thumbprint, invest in markets you'll never see in person. But that same ease has quietly concentrated power. When value is just data, whoever controls the database controls the value. Governments can freeze accounts, monitor flows, and create or destroy liquidity in ways the founders could hardly imagine. The old boundaries that silver and gold once imposed are gone. The constraints are no longer physical, they're political and technological. In this world, inflation stopped being a rare emergency and became a permanent background condition. Year after year, the purchasing power of the dollar erodes. For someone living in 2025, that erosion often feels abstract. A little more at the gas station, a little less in the grocery cart, an apartment that costs more than it did 5 years ago. But if you anchor today's dollar back to the original definition of 1792, the picture sharpens. A dollar defined as roughly 24 grams of silver would be worth many multiples of a modern paper dollar. In other words, over the centuries, the currency has lost well over 90% of its real buying power. What looks like a gradual drift is, on the scale of generations, a collapse. Every chart of rising prices, every complaint about wages not keeping up, is really a story about money being quietly hollowed out. And the way that hollowing happens isn't random. When new money is created, through central bank asset purchases, government deficits, or bank lending, it doesn't fall from the sky equally on everyone. It enters the system at specific points: large financial institutions, governments, corporations, asset markets. Those closest to the source of new money get to spend it before prices fully adjust. They buy real assets, stocks, property, and resources with fresher, stronger dollars. By the time that money trickles out into wages and consumer prices, the cost of everything has already moved. This is the Cantillon effect, the modern cousin of shaving silver from the coin's edge. In 1792, a corrupt minter might have secretly scraped dust off each dollar. In our era, policy can expand the money supply and call it stimulus, stability, or accommodation. The techniques are more sophisticated, the language more polite, but the outcome rhymes. Wealth shifts upward, and those who rely on savings and salaries feel the ground slipping beneath them. As money becomes more digital, another shift is underway. We are moving from money as a bearer instrument, something you hold and control, to money as a permissioned signal. Central banks and governments are experimenting with central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, that could, in theory, replace physical cash entirely. Advocates promise efficiency, inclusion, better data. But hidden inside the architecture of programmable money is a profound risk. If every unit of currency is just an entry in a centralized ledger, then every transaction can be monitored, categorized, and, if necessary, blocked. Spending could be steered with incentives or penalties. Certain purchases could be restricted. In an extreme case, money could be given an expiration date or turned off for individuals who fall afoul of whatever rules prevail at the moment. In such a system, money is no longer just a store of value or a medium of exchange. It becomes a system of control. That possibility cuts directly against the spirit of the Coinage Act of 1792. The founders wanted money to be something the citizen could trust precisely because it was hard to manipulate. A silver dollar didn't care who you voted for or what you believed. Its value lay in its weight and purity, not in your compliance. As we move toward systems in which value can be edited with software, that neutrality is threatened. The oldest idea in economic liberty, that your money is your property, can, in a world of total financial surveillance, be reduced to a conditional statement. Your money is yours as long as you remain in good standing. The form of money begins to shape the form of society. Around the world, you can already sense a growing unease with this trajectory. Central banks that once dismissed gold as a barbaric relic are quietly buying it again, adding tons of bullion to their reserves. Some nations are looking for ways to settle trade outside the dollar system. Cryptocurrencies, for all their volatility and flaws, represent a popular instinct to escape centralized control, to recreate, however imperfectly, a version of hard money in code. Ordinary people, squeezed by rising costs and stagnant real wages, are asking questions that would have made perfect sense to Hamilton and his peers. What gives money its value? Who benefits when new money is created? How much of my labor is real if the unit I'm paid in keeps melting? History suggests that monetary systems do not collapse just because the arithmetic fails. They collapse when people conclude that the system is no longer fair. The metallic standard of 1792 did not fail because gold and silver were inherently flawed. It failed because governments and institutions found those constraints inconvenient and worked to weaken them. The fiat system that replaced it will not fail simply because it uses paper or digital entries. It will fail, if it fails, because people decide that the trade, trust your savings to a system that constantly dilutes them in exchange for stability, no longer feels legitimate. Power, once given the ability to redefine value, rarely exercises that power modestly. Rome stretched its silver coinage until the denarius was a ghost of its former self. Revolutionary France printed paper assignats until they became scraps. Weimar Germany ran its presses until people needed wheelbarrows for bread. Each believed the crisis could be managed with clever policy. Each discovered that once trust breaks, numbers cannot save you. So where does that leave us now? In a strange way, back where we started. The next chapter of money is being written in real time, in central bank policy meetings, in the code of digital currencies, and in the daily choices of millions of people who decide what to hold, what to spend, and what to reject. The questions that haunted 1792 have not gone away. Is money meant to be real, measurable, and honest? Or is it meant to be flexible, strategic, and politically useful? Should it be a neutral yardstick or a lever of power? Every debate about inflation targets, deficit spending, quantitative easing, cryptocurrencies, or CBDCs is really an argument about that same fault line between money as a tool of freedom and money as a tool of control. The Coinage Act of 1792 now sits in the background of all this, like the ghost from a more concrete age. It reminds us that the founders saw money not just as an economic instrument, but as a moral contract. To them, debasing the currency was a kind of betrayal, an act that corroded the bond between citizen and state. For more than a century, tying the dollar to gold and silver imposed a kind of discipline, not just on markets, but on governments and banks. You could not spend what you could not back. You could not inflate away your mistakes without consequence. When that discipline was removed, what replaced it was not neutrality, but discretion. And discretion, over time, has a way of drifting towards those who already hold power. Maybe that is the deepest warning hidden in the history of the Coinage Act. It is not telling us to worship metal or reject technology. It is asking a harder question. What kind of society do you create when the unit that measures every contract, every wage, every savings account is allowed to shift under political pressure? When you look past the charts and jargon, you see a simple pattern. When money is honest, trust can grow. When money becomes a tool of convenience for the powerful, trust decays. The failure of modern money, if it comes, will not be a purely financial event. It will be a moral verdict that we forgot what the founders already understood, that the integrity of a nation's currency is one of the clearest measures of its moral strength.